Jelly Roll Morton, born Ferdinand Morton, um, began playing piano in brothels. He had lied to his grandmother that he was, working on the dock. He was in New Orleans, and when she found out what he was doing, she kicked him out of the house. He was a teenager, late teenager. Um, Here again, we have sort of jazz music with its sexual connotations. This is music literally played while you're doing, what, brothel music. So Jelly Roll Morton cut his teeth, so to speak, playing piano in these situations. He would go on to create his own jazz band and became a major success in the Midwest as well as in New York. Um, he claimed, like Nick LaRocca, well, Nick LaRocca thought it was a white man's invention. Jelly Roll Morton, who was Creole descent, claimed to have invented jazz himself. And there's some debate whether he was being egotistical or if he meant the kind of style he was kind of originating. So not everybody believes that he was just some arrogant dimwit, who thinks that he invented something that he didn't invent, but it may have been maybe the individual style. Um, the name Jelly Roll Morton. Okay, so how do you get the name Jelly Roll? This is something that uh, raised where I was. It was a very rural, very religious place. When I was a kid, I bought a book on jazz at a local bookstore, and the book talked about Jelly Roll Morton, and it said, "Oh, the name came from the donut, the dessert." Well, that's not true. That's nonsense. Jelly roll was a slang term for a woman's genitalia. Um, so again, there's that sexual association. What Jelly Roll Morton was able to do was maybe this is what he was sort of getting at with inventing jazz was combining blues and stride style effects. So we didn't call it stride piano. He didn't invent stride piano. Stride piano was sometimes associated with a pianist by the name of James P. Johnson. It's like the ragtime. Remember we talked about ragtime? If you have the left hand, you're playing the bass and these accompanying chords in the right hand, or left hand, excuse me. So you've got this kind of boom, chick, boom, chick, boom, chick. Stride piano is very difficult. You've got that moving very quickly, and you've got the right hand over here riffing this very intricate melody over top. So it's very difficult to pull off. So some of Jelly Roll Morton's tunes has that stride style effect with the left hand. So he was a very gifted pianist. We can probably gather this. Oh, he has recordings. We can get this from recordings, get this from the sheet music. Um, there's a tune of his, although I think the tune actually was older. It was actually an older blues tune, Hesitation Blues. Sometimes I think in country western music, this is a jug band tune. Hesitation Blues has that kind of bluesy lyrics, the AAB format, talking about hesitating when I can be with my woman next. So you have this idea of sexual desire again veiled. Why do I have to hesitate? So hesitating here meaning when can I be with you again? So that sexual connotation. Um, that's Jelly Roll Morton. That picture again. Uh, Creole background. We tend to remember this fellow. We tend to remember Louis Armstrong more than anybody else. The cornetist, trumpeter, Louis Armstrong, as well as a vocalist. He's a vocalist too. 1901 to 1971. Um, Again, like early jazz musicians, couldn't read music, but eventually learned to read music. He cut his teeth playing in King Oliver's jazz band. He played in riverboats up the Mississippi. Riverboats would hire bands to perform. He had jobs in various riverboats. Um, Talk about West End blues because he does sing and play the trumpet in this. This was a very famous recording about 1930, I believe this was, uh, or close to that era. So major hit record. Um, Louis Armstrong went by the name Satchmo. Again, that book I bought when I was a kid, and there's some, this might be true as well, but the book said, well, he got the name Satchmo because of his satchel shaped mouth. Well, that's not all the story. The rest of the story is he was very fond of smoking marijuana, smoked it every day, and would carry it around in a satchel. And so he got the name Satchmo partially because he had this satchel of weed. I have a friend who's a jazz historian, said that the satchel-shaped mouth is actually true as well. So it's he was called that, like Satchmo, Satch Mouth, kind of a slang for that. So that wasn't a total nonsensical story, but in my sort of my hometown, it was they didn't want to talk about weed, so that became the only story that was recorded in these books that they sold at usually Christian bookstores, which is kind of ironic that they're selling books about jazz, which had a sexual connotation in Christian bookstores. So that's just sort of where I'm from. West End Blues, I'll post to the YouTube channel. Um, Again, it features him playing trumpet as well as singing. I'm going to do a little demonstration here because we talk about the blues. I forgot to mention blues notes. This is a cornet here. This is my father-in-law's cornet. I'll give you an idea of what blues notes sounded like. You might be familiar with this if you like old rock and roll. Pardon my playing. I'm not very good. So that's a blues scale. Those are the notes you usually use in a blues scale, and you can improvise on top of that. What you have, essentially, you're flatting certain notes of the scale, the third and the seventh, and then you have sometimes a flat fifth in there. And that was the key of C. That was you have the F sharp, you have the F sharp G, or the G flat to G. So the blues notes used in the blue and West End blues, and he does sing. And you remember, if you ever heard any Armstrong recordings, he got this very gruff, kind of growling voice. You have a little less of that here. It's a little more, it's a little pure than what he became known for later with tunes like Hello Dolly and Wonderful World, if you remember. I Think to Myself, A Wonderful World, that song by Louis Armstrong. Then we're talking about this fellow and the whole idea of racial issues again with jazz. Because the king of jazz, Paul Whiteman, was sort of the uncrowned king of jazz. He didn't call himself this. I think music periodicals called him this. But they gave it to a white man whose name was literally Whiteman. So, again, the white invention kind of comes back in here. Paul Whiteman never claimed to have invented jazz. He had more respect for it. He actually believed it was an African American invention, as it is. But here's his dates, 1890 to 1967. Actually, was a classical musician, was a violinist, played in the Denver Symphony Orchestra, and you can see he later became a conductor, but he realized he could make more of an impact and, of course, more money playing popular music. And what was the popular music at the time? Of course, jazz. He forms his own jazz band, and he's really interested in what jazz can do for classical music. He has his own jazz numbers, most of which are rather tame. If you compare this with even like Nick LaRocca or certainly Jelly Roll Morton, it's got this sort of almost canned quality to it. I'll post a Whispering. I think Whispering is already on our YouTube channel. It actually uses a slide whistle. Sometimes uses a joke and certain circus performances, but the slide whistle here got a very prominent solo. Not a lot of improvisation. It's usually written down. So Whiteman is more interested in the rhythmic aspects of jazz, as well as the blues aspects, the blues notes, the compositional aspects that classical musicians could tap into. He's most famous for this event here, this experiment in modern music in New York City's Aeolian Hall in 1924, which combined classical pieces as well as jazz pieces, mostly classical pieces based upon jazz as an element itself. And so the most famous piece from this concert was George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. If you've ever flown United Airlines, It's sort of a doctored version, but it's the theme song for United Airlines. It's not improvised at all. It's piano and jazz band. You got the forces of jazz. It's almost concerto-like, but you've got several things happening here. You've got use of the blues notes, use of blues elements, but the classical sort of rhapsody. What a rhapsody is, remember the Hungarian rhapsodies of Liszt, rhapsodies are written to sort of sound like they're improvisatory, although they are written down. So you've got that improvisational element, but it's not done on the spot. It's sort of built into the musical, into the notation itself. So Rhapsody in Blue, kind of a play on a romantic genre as well as a new kind of musical style, and that's blues or jazz. I mean, they are interchangeable. Jazz and blues are distinct things, but since jazz did draw on the blues, this was part of this concert dedicated to jazz and classical fusion. Um, so Paul Whiteman's very interested in this whole idea. I'll post both of these. You might be familiar with Rhapsody in Blue. Got the famous clarinet solo that opens it all the way up to the high C. Got the slide effect. It's use of the blues notes there. So the Gershwin. I don't have a picture of Gershwin. I probably should have put one on here. Gershwin was popular as a composer of Broadway musicals and as well as an opera featuring an all-black cast, Porgy and Bess. Before this, he was a Tin Pan Alley song composer. So worked on Tin Pan Alley, writing songs, usually with his brother Ira Gershwin doing the lyrics. So the Gershwin's very popular. Gershwin was Jewish. He was from Brooklyn. Had the same teacher as Aaron Copland. We'll talk about Aaron Copland. So Gershwin wanting to be considered a classical composer. And that's what he was most interested in doing, raising jazz to a level of classical of art, of classical appreciation. Um, some other pieces influenced by jazz here. This is the jazz with a little j. You can maybe call Rhapsody in Blue jazz with a little j, the jazz in quotes, because it's not really jazz, it's classical music inspired by jazz. You have this other composers drawing upon it as well. I'll talk through some of these briefly. Debussy does this with a suite called The Children's Corner and a tune called Gollywog's Cakewalk. He wrote this for a doll that his daughter had. The Gollywog doll, yeah, it was a black-faced doll. It's got a racial connotation there. But he wrote this cakewalk, and cakewalks were African American dances. So not jazz inherently, but it's got this African American aspect to it. The cakewalk was sometimes used, practiced among former slaves to make fun of their white masters. So it was satirical. So Gollywog's Cakewalk has a very distinctive kind of syncopation. Gershwin writes his own piano concerto, not just a Rhapsody in Blue. He has a second Rhapsody as well, but the piano concerto is a three-movement concerto for piano and orchestra that has that distinct Gershwinite, Gershwin-esque sound. The sort of the blues, jazz, popular Tin Pan Alley element. Aaron Copland. We'll talk about Aaron Copland. We'll talk about American music, but writes a piece in 1925 called "Music for Theater." Basically, jazz for a jazz band, music for the theater. So he got a lot of. It was scandalous for the time to do this, to bring jazz into the concert hall, and so he got blasted in the press for doing that. Oh, how dare you! Sully the concert hall with jazz. Remember, jazz had that sexual connotation. Stravinsky taps into it in A Ragtime for 11 Instruments. So here again, the new classicist will sometimes pick up on jazz because, Stravinsky, because it sounded a little more objective. No, it's not objective, but this was sort of the goal. It had this percussive aspect to it that would lend itself to objectivity. One of my favorite pieces is Prelude, Fugue, and Riff by Leonard Bernstein, which I'll post all of these to our YouTube channel. And there's also, of course, third stream music of the 1950s, which was Gunther Schuller. Running out of time, so I'll stop it here. We'll have some other videos later this week when we talk about our next topic. So see you in a second, or see you in a bit.